Today, we're going to be talking about phrasing. Phrasing. Quite literally, a phrase is just a certain length of music. Phrases sit somewhere in between a period and a motif in terms of their length. A phrase is smaller than a period of music, and a motif is smaller than a phrase in music. This pen is gone. You could also say that a phrase happens between two resting points in a song. This pen's out. So during a musical phrase, musical things happen, like harmonic development or tension buildup and release. And theoretically speaking, a phrase is characterized by how it arranges different types of motifs in different orders. Motifs come in a lot of different forms, and they interact with each other in different ways. They can repeat each other, they can imitate each other, they can transpose each other, they can reverse the same melody called retrograde, or they can scale up or down called a augmentation or diminution of the rhythmic value of the melody. But this is just music theory. Oftentimes thinking theoretically about music feels like math, but music is not math. In fact, music is more often like a language than math. When we're talking about phrasing, it's much more helpful to think of music as a language. So let's use an analogy to help explore this concept of phrasing. If music were like language, in this analogy, a symphony would be like a whole book of music because it has a lot of different songs in the same work. A movement within the symphony is like a chapter. Within one of the movements or songs, a period would be like a paragraph or a section of the chapter. You can think of periods kind of like verses in a song that repeats. So in our analogy, a phrase is like a musical complete sentence. So a motif would be like the parts of the sentence, and notes would be like syllables. So going along with this analogy a little bit further, that means that we use dynamics, articulation, intonation, expressive markings, tempo, and a million other tools to help us form our musical sentences. They function like punctuation does for regular speech. You have periods and commas and asterisks and all sorts of things to help you clarify what you mean when you're writing. Same thing applies to music. So in this song, we have a few different phrases. They're pretty clearly laid out between periods of rest. So we could call this the first phrase. But we could also call it the first motif, because right after that, we have which sounds very similar. So if we put together those two motifs, it makes more sense as one phrase. And that would be a bigger period of rest, signified by the two imitations of the same idea. And then it moves on to something a little different, like this. And we could call that the first phrase, but let's keep going. So let's put those two motifs together to make the second phrase. We have the building of tension and the release of tension. And then it comes back and repeats this again for the third phrase. But it goes somewhere completely different. So the ending of the third phrase is where we have our final cadence and our sense of finality. So you could say that the third phrase begins by borrowing from the second phrase and using that to play with our expectations about the song. So phrases are like complete sentences. And if we were to end any one of these phrases in the middle, it would sound just as weird as if you walked up to somebody and said, "and bought some vegetables," and then walked away. Let's give it a shot. Let's take out the second half of the first phrase and see what that does to the feeling of the song. There was a strong feeling of disconnection between the first phrase and the second phrase because we didn't complete our sentence. Let's listen to it again as it's supposed to be. It connects, it's smooth, it's one sentence and another sentence. Music is not a language, but it is very speech-like. And if you want to hear a composer that has particularly speech-like patterns, you should check out Mozart. I know it's cheesy to talk about one of the greatest composers of all time being a good example of something, but it's true. Even compared to other composers who are just as famous, Mozart's phrases are particularly good. Mozart. They're particularly clear. Their emotional content is so easy to devour that it brings our focus onto the beauty of the melody and not just onto the sonority or the weird thing about the piece. His music contains a lot of playing around with the melody in a similar way that a lighthearted or entertaining speech would do, and it comes to very clear resting points with a very clear emotional character. And that allows us to enjoy his music as it is, as a very clearly presented work of art. Mozart. To put it a little more simply, Mozart's music is easy to emphasize, not what it says on the board. Mozart's music is easy to empathize with. And this begs a very interesting question. How do you write music that's easy to empathize with? Did Mozart write this into the score? He must have written in all sorts of expression markings that covered the whole page, right? Well, not exactly. Mozart was definitely a genius, but some of that genius quality is also in the genius of the musicians that perform his work. Because he wrote his music intuitively, the phrasing is obvious to the musician playing the music without having to write it out specifically. If you were playing "Mary Had a Little Lamb," you would intuitively know how to phrase this song. It's somewhat self-explanatory. For example, you might know to take a breath after "Mary had a little lamb." So you might write a breath marking here. You might know that we're not going to sing it super loud or super soft, so we're going to sing it at mezzo piano. And this melody doesn't need to be very march-like or accented, so we'll probably sing this whole thing legato, like one smooth line of music. These things are just known to performers, and phrasing is largely intuitive. It's not notated. Music that is speech-like oftentimes is easy to phrase on its own without markings. Composers will often notate only when something is different than a musician would normally do, playing the song intuitively. So if we added some unexpected markings, it might sound like this. Mary had a little lamb. So we might want to notate that because we wouldn't normally do that when we're singing through the piece. Mozart used surprisingly few dynamic markings compared to modern composers. Even though things were still a bit different during Mozart's time, he still used a moderate amount of dynamic markings, and the rest was left up to the virtuosic musicians that played his music. To say it in yet another way, musical symbols are not instructions. Musical symbols are descriptions. They guide you to play the music more in line with the composer's intention. Of course, it's not just the symbols that guide your intuition about how to play a piece, it's also the context that helps make those decisions for you. Not just the context of the phrase within the period within the piece, but also the context of history, culture, tradition, and the musical practice that you're taking part in. And sometimes it just comes down to a simple question of, does it sound pleasing to us or not? If you have a piece of music with lyrics, lyrics oftentimes dictate how the phrasing goes very strongly. Because music is like a language, having literal language in the music gives you very clear indication of where to emphasize different words and where to pause between literal sentences. The analogy with music and language becomes much stronger at that point because you'll have musical symbols being used to reinforce the emphasis that the composer wants on certain words. Sometimes we'll even use musical symbols and musical structures to illustrate the content of the lyrics, and that's called word painting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something and gained a little bit of insight into how we phrase music like language. If you could, please click subscribe. I need 1,000 subscribers before I make any more ad revenue, so if you don't mind, just click subscribe. It's like giving me a donation, but you don't have to pay for it. I also want to thank Amber and Nick for helping me film this episode. You guys are awesome, and hopefully we'll have another episode coming at you in 1 week.